What's going on, Skullbrains? Welcome back to Skullbrain TV. It's time to find out if our saviors of the ancestral world survived the crashing waves in issue number 19 of The Ancestral Trail.
When he, who is the chosen one, shall tread upon the ancient path and battle there to overcome
the forces of the dark.
The Ancestral Trail, an epic story of myths, magic, and monsters. Book 19. Nemis, Master of the Deep, in the Merman's underwater prison.
Yes, in the last episode, Richard, Orkin, and Melik come across a mysterious hidden island where they are attacked by a vicious winged lion, Cronus. Escaping from the beast, they find themselves in a maze and happen upon a captured guardian Tusker. In order to free the trapped guardian, they must retrieve his weapons from their enemy. After doing so, they free Tusker, and his fallen brethren begin to return to life and destroy Cronus, therefore returning the island to its rightful owners. After bidding Tusker goodbye, the trio are back in their boat but are faced with the crashing ocean that is set to drown them, ending their journey. So let's see how they survive, but first, let's go over the Ancestral Challenge for this issue. You'll need to find Shumi and Shubi. Also in this issue, the Merman King's trident is hidden somewhere in the pages. See if you can spot it. The answers will be revealed at the end of the episode, so stick around. As for Morbane's Monsters and Magic Challenge, in the pinned comment below, you'll find a link where you can download the 2 cards for this issue. Have a read and see if you can guess who Nemis is based on, the Sirens or Lorelei. The answer will be revealed in the next episode. And as for the last episode, if you guessed that Cronus was based on the Griffin, you were correct. Okay, are you ready? Let's do this.
On the 19th day, sea falls fast and deep, ship speeds deeper still, down to hidden coral keep, where evil wreaks its will. Merman King locks the spell, Guardian's magic is the key. Chosen one must use it well to set the others free.
Water filled the air, soaking the trio to the skin as their battered craft rose and fell on the huge waves. There was nothing they could do against such elemental forces. They crouched in the bow, their backs blasted by salt spray. Finally, the storm blew out, leaving them on a calm sea. To Richard's astonished delight, he could see land on 3 sides. Only in one spot did the waves reach out to the horizon. The hurricane had blown them into a lagoon. Richard and Orkin began to paddle, while Melik bailed out water. After a while, the shore seemed no nearer. Richard realized that the tide was going out, and they were being sucked back into the ocean at a fearsome rate. As they neared the mouth of the lagoon, they heard the thunder of cascading water. "What's that?" Richard asked. "It must be a seafall," Melik replied. "It's a ridge of rocks across a lagoon's mouth that's covered at high water, but turns into a waterfall at low tide." "Hold on tight," Richard shouted as the craft shot towards the edge. They hung onto the boat as it grated against rock, then they were over, sliding down a wall of water. The impact shattered the small craft and drove the wind out of Richard. He plunged deep into an opaque maelstrom, and for one awful second he touched the seabed, before the piece of trunk he was holding onto began to lift him to the surface. Red stars were exploding in his oxygen-starved brain by the time his head broke water. He drank in the air greedily, coughing and spluttering as he did so. His salt-wrecked eyes barely registered Orkin and Melik as they popped up either side of him, each draped over a length of timber. "Are you okay?" Richard bellowed to the others. Orkin tried to reply, but immediately received a mouthful of brine. Melik raised a tired hand. "A boat!" he croaked. "Look!" They followed his pointing finger and saw an old schooner slicing towards them. Its sails were in tatters. There was no sign of a crew, nothing to say that they had been spotted. The dark vessel creamed its way over the sea, a rope ladder trailing from the side. Richard grabbed it and scrambled up a few rungs to make space for Orkin and Melik. The three clambered on board and collapsed in exhaustion. When they had recovered, they looked around. The ship was deserted, and a large brass diving bell stood unattended on the deck. "Let's read the prophecy," Melik said, opening the book. As they pondered the message, they heard footsteps and turned around. The ship was heaving with activity. Sailors were reefing sails, battening hatches, lashing down loose objects. It was as if they were getting ready for a storm. Orkin walked over to the helmsman. "You saved our lives," he said, patting the sailor's back in thanks. His hand passed through nothingness, and he stumbled forward. It's a ghost," he spluttered. "We're on a ghost ship!" The ghost sailor turned to Orkin. He was lashed to the wheel, and no face looked out of the mildew-covered canvas of his foul weather hood. Suddenly a short piping trill rang in the air. Instantly the crew dashed below, leaving only the helmsman. "What's happening?" Richard shouted. He got no reply. Instead, the spectre turned the wheel, and the ship took a nosedive. Richard, Orkin and Melik were held against the rails. They realized that the ship was heading for the deep. First the bow, and then the foredeck were submerged in a froth of seawater. "Get to the diving bell!" Richard yelled. They hurried over to the brass bell. Orkin spun the hatch wheel, and they scrambled in, slamming the hatch shut with only seconds to spare. As the ship sank under the waves, they inspected their new quarters. It was a small globular room, whose ceiling pressed uncomfortably against their heads. "I hope we don't have to stay in here long," Melik said. "The air can't last forever." Richard had not considered this. Had they escaped drowning only to die a lingering death by suffocation? All at once the atmosphere seemed hot and stuffy. "Look," Orkin said, his nose pressed to a porthole. The ship was skimming along the sea floor through a coral maze, whose formations were fashioned into houses and streets. The three were peering at massive carved pillars when a jolt threw them against the glass. The ship had come to rest, and the bell had rolled off the deck onto the sea floor. The crew clambered off the ship and dragged the diving bell across the seafloor until they reached the gates of a palace. The three peered through the portal as the crew hauled the bell into a magnificent throne room, thronged with strange creatures. Every surface in the room was covered in shells that gleamed in the gloom. A vicious-looking merman holding a coral trident floated towards them. "This must be Nemis, the Merman King," Melik murmured. The merman swirled to a stop by the portal and peered into the bell. His features were thin and pinched, and a bony nose jutted between cold, slanting eyes. His menacing stare held them entranced before he finally spoke.
"At last, the chosen one. I have waited for such a prize."
The three were astonished to find they could hear underwater.
"You can join the twin guardians of the fishes, Tishon and Shunta, until I deliver you to the evil one,"
Nemis added. He made a sweeping gesture towards a net in which two figures, covered in spines and feathery fins, writhed helplessly. Nemis waved his hand upwards. A huge octopus was floating gently down towards the bell. Its tentacles fanned out beneath a huge black hood, and thin tendrils of ink dribbled from its beak as it prepared to enfold the three in its grip. Richard was trying to remember the words of the prophecy when he sensed Golan's voice saying,
Free the Guardians, and you too will be saved.
Turning to his companions, he said, "We've got to free Tishon and Shunta." The other two nodded in agreement. Richard spun the hatch wheel. Water gushed in round the edges. He told Melik and Orkin to take a deep breath and flung the hatch open. The trio burst out and swam as fast as they could towards the Guardians. Nemis was swimming back to his throne and did not notice their escape. nor did the octopus, whose vision was blocked by the carpet of tentacles, which were already closing around the diving bell. Richard drew his dagger and hacked furiously at the net. He was almost bursting from holding his breath. Suddenly, a webbed hand snaked through the hole and grabbed his weapon. Another pulled Richard into the net. A scaly mask was pressed to his face, and miraculously, Richard could breathe. He saw one of the guardians rip through the net with his dagger. Tishon and Shunta were free. Then they clamped masks over the faces of Orkin and Melik. For the first time since going underwater, Richard felt a sense of hope. By now, Nemis was aware of the escape and was hurtling towards them, his trident poised to strike. The guardians came at him from either side, but he was able to keep them at bay, and he even succeeded in driving them back. Then Richard felt a disturbance in the water. The octopus had uncurled itself from the diving bell and was swirling towards the guardians. Tishon and Shunta were at his mercy. A sleek dolphin shot from nowhere and rammed the octopus, throwing it into an inky cartwheel of sprawling tentacles. The newcomer danced around its enemy, dodging out of reach every time a tentacle swung out. The guardians were quickly forgotten as the octopus lumbered after its elusive foe. Richard heaved a sigh of relief. Once again, the guardians had a chance. Or did they? Nemis was doing well with his trident. Too well, Richard decided. This was the moment of which the prophecy had spoken. He unbuckled Kika's belt and threw it into the fray. The belt travelled through the water and spat forward of its own accord, wrapping itself around the trident. The weapon, which had seemed so threatening, snapped like a brittle twig. The effect was astonishing. Deprived of his power source, Nemis began to fall apart. The process started at the tip of his tail and worked steadily up his body, chunks of flesh drifting away until his lower half looked like an X-rayed fish. There was nothing Nemis could do. His face was the last to go, slobbering off the bone in lumps and shreds. All that remained of the merman was a pile of foul matter on the seafloor, and a frail skeleton that rose and fell idly on the current. Richard looked around him. The host of marine creatures that had previously lined the room were now curling and swooping in jubilation. The spell on them had been lifted. The dolphin swam up to Richard and the guardians.
Where did the dolphin come from?
Richard asked Tishon.
It's Duna, last of the sea mammals,
The guardian replied.
He managed to escape the spell that fell on the rest of his people, and has been a constant thorn in Nemesis' side. We were lucky he was here today. Duna will carry you back to land,
Shunta said.
Where are you heading next?
Richard consulted the Pathfinder and showed Duna the glowing arrow.
Then you are headed for Frigoria.
Duna said.
It's the coldest place I know, and it's also where my people are being held prisoner in walls of ice.
That's where the Pathfinder directs us, so that's where we must go,
Richard replied.
Perhaps we can help your people.
Take this,
Shunta said, handing Richard a small bottle.
It's a special oil which will protect you from the worst of the cold if you rub it into your skin. Good luck, and thank you for saving us from Nemis. May you fare as well in your next encounter.
Shunta and Tishon raised their hands in salute and swam to join their newly freed forces. The trio clambered onto Duna's back, and soon the coral city was left far behind. They rose steadily through the sea until they finally emerged on the surface, splashing in graceful arcs across the waves. As they came into contact with the air, their masks disintegrated. The three could breathe freely again. As Duna had warned, it was cold. The sea thickened into a sludge of ice crystals that slopped in the ocean swell. Despite Shunta's oil, the companions were chilled to the marrow. A ribbon appeared on the horizon. As they got nearer, the ribbon expanded until it became a sheer cliff of ice that stretched on either side as far as the eye could see. They had arrived at Frigoria. Before the cliff stretched a no-man's land of pack ice. Near the shore it looked solid enough. On the seaward fringe, it was a jumble of ice blocks that ground angrily against each other, separated only by thin, half-frozen channels. It would be impossible to cross on foot, and almost certain death to cross it in the water. Duna headed for the widest channel he could find. He was scouting round the edge of the solid pack for a landing point when the channel began to narrow. Ice was pushing in from the sea fast, masses of it. They were trapped. And that is the end of issue 19. So how did you go with the Ancestral Challenge? Did you see Shumi and Shubi? If you didn't, I don't blame you, because they were here on page 303 wearing these fish masks, so they could have easily just been mistaken as fish. As for Nemis's trident, that was hidden here on page 294. Don't forget you can download the monster and magic cards in the pinned comment below. There were no map pieces or letter tokens in this issue, but this issue does remind me of a joke that I just heard, so I will end with that. What do you call a fish with no eyes? A fish. It's terrible. Thanks so much for watching this episode of Skullbrain TV. Don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button and ring that little bell icon to be notified of when the next issue is released. And until then, as always, stay tuned, stay Skullbrained.